Welcome to the Proactive Employer. I'm Stephanie Thomas. Have you thought about the way you communicate? When you're having a conversation with someone, are you focused in on that conversation? Or are you thinking about the other 80 items on your to-do list? Do you tailor the message to the specific audience you're communicating with? Or do you deliver the same words in the same way to the C-suite, supervisors and managers, and the hourly staff? Modifying the way you communicate can have a big impact. The good news is our guest today thinks that HR gets its conversations right about 80% of the time, but there's always room for improvement. And today, we're joined by someone who's really great at conversations, William Tincup. William describes himself as, quote-unquote, strange because he excels at marketing, sales, and HR. He's one of the leading thinkers on social media application for human resources, an expert on adoption of HR technology, and he knows a thing or two about marketing. William runs Tincup & Co., a company that serves as a sounding board for human resources practitioners and HR vendors. He's been blogging on HR issues since 2007 and contributes to Fistful of Talent, Talent Culture, and HR Examiner. William also co-hosts Drive Through HR, a daily podcast focusing on HR issues and HR practitioners. He's great at conversations, and it's truly a pleasure to have him with us today. Good morning, William, and welcome to the Proactive Employer.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
We're very pleased to have you. Now, you describe yourself as somebody who's great at conversations. Why is that? What makes somebody great at conversations?
Well, I think, there's aptitude and attitude, right? So you can have a great attitude about becoming good or even great about something, but you also have to have the aptitude, and or you can have the aptitude, but not be willing to invest in what it takes. So I think some of it kind of comes down to the expectations you have for a conversation, how you set those, how others set those for you, and it's all both, sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's implicit, but, when someone says, hey, I can't wait for us to talk tomorrow, that's pretty subtle. It's like, hey, I can't wait. We talk like that, right? I can't wait to talk to you tomorrow. But if you peer past that, it's like, well, wait, what about that conversation tomorrow is so important, or is that just something that we're saying? So I think it's like understanding the expectations. That could be someone that really wants to drop something on you, that really wants to get your advice, that really want to know. So it's becoming aware and then just kind of asking a couple probative questions like, well, hey, let's make sure that we have the same expectation. Are we just kind of catching up? Or we're just kind of gossiping and kind of hanging out and just, being friends? No, you're changing your careers. Oh, well, great. Now I'm going to have a different expectation for that conversation, which is great. It's like, how do you not get blindsided, right? So that's kind of a game of expectations. But also, once you know what some of those expectations are, you prepare. You care enough to prepare, to orchestrate, to have a good conversation, because they just don't. It's been my experience, at least, that they just don't happen out of nowhere. So I think furthering that thought, I think you have to listen. You can't just talk. That's one side of it, like communication, listening and talking, sending and receiving, if you will. But I think it's when you listen, you have to listen to what's being said, and you also have to listen to what's not being said. So it's almost like looking for the words that haven't come up in a conversation, maybe the obvious, maybe the not so obvious, and so you can kind of form some opinions and some probative questions about that. Well, I hear that you're changing jobs, but you haven't really said why. What's going on? What are the drivers? Like, why the change? Why do you need to get out of that place? What's going on? I think the formulation of insightful questions is very difficult. I think that people generally that are good at conversations are inquisitive people. They've either trained themselves or they're genetically wired that way, etc. But they're inquisitive. They really, really want to They want to know. They have this brain, this wiring, this whatever, and their mind is filled with questions. And so when they're in a conversation with somebody, they're not just, there are people that are really great at kind of like cocktail conversations, when they, just kind of mixing about and talking about the weather and, talking about other things like that. And then there are those they can do that, but really they thrive in asking a bunch of questions and garnering feedback and kind of going back and forth, that dance, if you will. The last two things I think is frank dialogue. To be good at conversations, you've got to be able to call BS kind of when you see it or hear it. And so when someone's asking your advice, if you're really, really good at that type of conversation, you're good at delivering frank feedback. You want to be the CEO, totally understand. First of all, do you not have the work history and the experience to become a CEO? You don't have the educational pedigree. You don't have the network. You probably are going to be at your peak an operations person. And maybe from then you can parlay that into CEO experience. Like giving someone that frank, like, yeah, I'm sorry. If you're really asking for my advice, I'm going to give it to you because I care about you, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm going to give it to you in a way that's frank. And I think lastly, if you want to have a great conversation, there probably should be some actionable, outcomes. There should be some type of actions from it. And I think that's holding each other or multiple people to that type of expectation. It forms a good conversation. It's like, we're going to come together, we're going to share some thoughts, we're going to brainstorm, we're going to do some things, but the net of it, the result of it will be X and Y. And I think sometimes not having that orientation, you can find yourself in a conversation with no outcomes, which is great, but it assumes that you have a lot of time.
You've mentioned a lot of points here about having actionable outcomes and setting right expectations and listening as much as you're speaking and, having that frank dialogue and telling somebody their baby's ugly if their baby is really ugly. We're going to come back to those points, but I want to ask you to make a sweeping generalization here, so bear with me. When it comes to the HR profession as a whole, do you think HR is great at conversation? What generally goes right in the HR conversations? And what areas of improvement do you see? What needs to be tweaked?
I think HR gets a lot of things right, quite frankly. I think on one level, I think HR is a great a receptacle for feedback. I think they generally care about 360. All the way the upward communication, downward communication, lateral communication. I think they take feedback well. I think when employees say, hey, this is not great, or can we do this, I think HR is hardwired to listen to that feedback. So I think that I'd say 80% of it is done. We're good. Check. I think HR is competent and maybe even thrives at conversations. Where it breaks down is in the difficult area, when there's a conflict. I think HR is probably not as great at communicating, bad news, and or telling somebody their baby's ugly, or using satire, humor, or other types of tone to deliver, not the easiest of contents. And personally, it's been my experience, HR gets about 80% of it pretty well. Maybe that's a gift. Maybe it's 70%. But the majority of it, I think HR does well. I think it's the harder part is when you have to deliver bad news. And it's because we're not good at it. And I would think that one of the reasons we're not good at it is because we don't do it that frequently. Like if you have to deliver bad news all the time, you're probably pretty good at it. But we don't have to deliver bad news that often, and we don't really have great practice, like scenarios and situations and case studies where we have to do it. It's like, as a for example, if you have to deliver a kind of a layoff message, and you haven't had layoffs in 12 years, well, how do you reach back into your arsenal of best practices and say, how do we communicate layoffs? Like to everybody, how do we get through that beating? Now, if you're laying people off every year or every quarter, it turns out you've got some muscle memory around how to communicate around layoffs. So I think it's the negative or fierce or conflicting, like discussions or conversations around conflict that are probably the hardest or more challenging for HR to get. And Stephanie, I think it's probably something to learn there from an HR conference perspective or from a SHRM perspective. This is probably great content for them to really kind of help train, help facilitate learning and training in the area of how to deliver bad news.
Bad news is not really something that we can just create out of nowhere to practice giving it to people. Are there kind of concrete suggestions that you have on how to practice this? I mean, how would you go about actually practicing, having these difficult conversations and dealing with the conflict and delivering the bad news?
Yeah. Well, I think you can do, it's like scenario training. They do this a lot in negotiations, actually. If you want to learn how to negotiate, you have to practice negotiation. So they throw you in a scenario with a bunch of your peers, and then you're representing one side of the argument and one side of the negotiation, and they throw you into a negotiation to then, negotiate. And so I think you can kind of use the model of scenarios as a great way to practice, get muscle memory. So I think local chapters, all the way to statewide organizations and even SHRM, national, I think we can just create scenarios where people come together and you practice receiving bad news, you practice giving bad news. So I think the focus is how to train and garner muscle memory around delivering bad news and delivering conflict, and also how to take it in some levels. So you want to be able to see it from the audience's perspective as well. So I think also the writing part of things and best practices around how to do that. So as Harvard Business Review case studies are kind of a great example of seeing things from multiple perspectives. I think that type of content is great as it relates to how to communicate in general, how to communicate with an audience. And we're really kind of zeroed in on how to communicate to an audience around, negative or, bad news or something that's really kind of got a high conflict message, et cetera. I think in general, how do you communicate to an audience is probably something that, more HR practitioners should practice.
And talking about the audience, that's a really interesting point. And I think it ties into one of your themes, and it's a theme that I really like a lot, is that HR professionals should communicate more like sales and marketing professionals. And, on this podcast, we tend to focus on EEO compliance issues and workforce issues. It seems to me that communicating like a sales and marketing professional when talking about affirmative action to the C-level or, recruiting outreach to the disabled community or the veterans community could really, really work well. Would you talk about what it means to communicate like a sales and marketing pro and why it's important for HR practitioners to figure out how to do this?
Yeah, great point, Stephanie. I think that ultimately where HR can learn from marketing and sales is there's always an action. You're always driving towards some type of action. In marketing, you want them to, click a link. You want them to fill out a form. You want them to do something. And in sales, you want to move them forward in the sales process all the way to proposal and close or whatever. You want them to buy stuff. So there's an action, and I think sometimes we lose that in HR is like, first of all, I want you to take an action. Second of all, you're not all the same, meaning there's a large audience, and ultimately inside that audience is different audience groups. So the C-suite is a group, the board is a group, the management team is a group, HR, the department is a group. You've got hourly employees, professional employees. 80% of your message might be able to transcend all of those groups. But it's nuanced, and that's what marketing does really well is they understand the nuanced content and how it would resonate with a particular group. And so it's highly personalized, and that's the thing. We don't just create one email that goes out to 600,000 people. We'll create 80% of that email that goes out to 600,000 people, but it's nuanced with the other 20% that we know that audience group cares most about. So I think it's understanding that we have an audience. So like employees are important, but they make up a part of our audience. So it's thinking holistically about all of the audience, now the external and internal. So now where we really have some learning to do is now, because of social media, HR also owns a piece of the external brand. You know, the candidate experience, if you will, the recruiting experience, the employment brand, not just internally but externally. So our audience, and I would say this is probably a kind of a new thing over the last couple of years, but our audience has gotten bigger and more refined in the way that they like communication. And we, as HR professionals, we haven't followed that refinement.
And to return to something you said about taking an action, there always has to be an action, either to click the link or to buy the product. It seems to me that a lot of times the conversations, particularly about compliance, try to achieve that action through fear. If we don't improve our African American utilization rates, we're going to get sued. If we don't hire more women, we're going to end up under, OFCCP investigation. How can we change the dynamic of that conversation from a fearful perspective to looking at compliance as really something that's proactive and really turn it into a positive action outcome?
Yeah, I think in some ways I think you have to change the dialogue around diversity and inclusion and not necessarily make it about the have-to part, but make it about how it will enrich your employment experience and the bottom line. So if you take the line of thinking that diversity is great, but really diversity, at its heart, what it does is it gives you diversity of thought. And internally, how do you innovate if you don't have diversity of thought? So it's great that you check some things off because the law demands you to check things off. Yes, you'll do that. But really there's a greater reason for why you care about diversity. It's because it'll drive the bottom line. It'll make you more profitable. It'll make you a larger, better, deeper, more sustainable company because you won't be blindsided because of your lack of this diversity. Not from a legal perspective. That doesn't matter. It's like you can't legislate common sense. You can, however, create a company and an environment that'll be here 150, 200 years from now. And you do that because of at your values, you have a diversity of thought internal.
I think that's something Joe Gerstant refers to as cognitive diversity.
Mm-hmm. He's brilliant. He is absolutely my favorite diversity and inclusion thought leader because it's not about race. I mean, for so many years, when you say the word diversity, HR, they kind of they curl up into the fetal position because they're just beaten down with the race and or the gender side of diversity. And I think those things, we're past that stuff. I mean, we're not technically past it. Race and gender are very important and will always be important, but a conversation, because it's not resonating with people, we need to move their mentality past those things and say those are, of course, important. But what we really need to drive towards is all forms of diversity. And why is that? Because it will make you ultimately a better company, a more profitable company or organization. It could be a nonprofit or, a faith-based organization or a school or whatever. But ultimately, surrounding yourself with a bunch of people that think like you, that are like you, that look like you, is a one-way ticket to finding yourselves out of business. And that's not just the legal part of it, but just ultimately you get blindsided by the market.
I completely agree. And when we're having these conversations about diversity in all of its aspects, cognitive diversity and getting differences of thought in there, one of the action items from that conversation might be to identify particular groups of people or particular thought processes that we want to bring into our organization. And I think in order to identify those missing thought process pieces, we need to really understand what's going on in the workplace. And this leads me to a blog post that you wrote last year at Fistful of Talent, and it was a really great blog post. It was about becoming aware in the workplace. And you talked about the truth of the workplace being in the processes, the people, and in the numbers, the metrics that you manage. Would you give us just a quick rundown on, what those things are and really how to become aware of what's going on in the workplace?
Yeah, I think some of this is also, driven by where we're at, economically, but people are busy. So the new normal that people, talk about, blog about, write about, whatever, is everyone is doing more with less, and that's really the new normal. And they're so busy that they don't have time to pay attention to what's going on. They literally have to go in, check things off the list, move as fast as possible. It's like the sense of drowning, that they've checked 100 things off the to-do list, but they didn't get anything done. And so it's this feeling of drowning. And I think the call to action from that particular blog post is the same that triathletes have. It's the mentality that a triathlete has of go slow to go fast. So really put your to-do list off to the side for a moment and become aware. Like, what's really going on in the workplace? What's really going on in this particular conversation? So when you schedule an interview with an employee, instead of thinking the 80 things that you have to be doing, both at that particular time or after the interview, you know what? Just focus on that one interview for 50. Even if it's a shorter interview, instead of giving it 30 minutes. Maybe it's a 15-minute interview, but you're with them the entire time. You're not multitasking. So you're truly aware of everything that's going on for that shorter amount of time. And I think it's looking at everything that you're doing and you're touching and saying, okay, why? Why am I doing this? What's ultimately to be gained? What am I learning? How do I actually, like we're so busy. But I think it's just inertia at this point that's kind of keeping a lot of HR pros going. Is the feeling of just getting some things off their list, and they're finding themselves further and further and further away from the reality of their workplace, not closer. And so I think there's a time and a place. I think the busyness side of things has really kind of clouded us from really being in that moment and being aware. And it's a challenge. Personally, I would tell you a couple of years ago, probably a decade ago, I was the guy at a networking event that would be talking to you, but really looking at the room and evaluating who I needed to talk to next. So I was kind of talking to you, Stephanie, but I was really thinking about the guy or the gal that I needed to talk to next. So I was working the room. And at one point, I don't know if it was just through a bad experience or whatever, I decided to not scan the room. I literally said, you know what, whatever's in the room is in the room, but right now I'm actually with Stephanie, and I just need to pay attention to Stephanie. Like, my job now just changed. I just need to pay attention to Stephanie. And while we might not talk for that long, I'm going to give that conversation, that moment, everything, and I'm going to be aware of everything going on in that conversation. And when it's done, then I'll move on. And I think that's the hardest thing in the world for HR pros to get, is that they can learn from everything in their organization, every interaction, every process, the people, everything. But it's training your mind, like the Matrix, right? It's training your mind to then see what is seen and unseen. And I think you have to go slower to relax a little bit so that you can become aware to see those things.
And I think you're absolutely right that slowing down to do more and to be more effective is absolutely the right way to go. And it seems to me if you're talking to somebody but you're scanning the room thinking about the next conversation or the next 20 things on your to-do list, you're not going to be as tuned into not only what's being said but what's not being said. How important is it in conversations to really understand and pick up on what's not being said?
I think it's at least 50% of the battle. I think that if you're just there on the surface level, literally hanging on every literal word that the person's saying, you're probably missing some of the subtext. and some of the context to what's kind of going on. So I think that you have to spend, a little bit of the time while you're talking and just asking follow-up questions, and being and just to clarify. Like, I think I'm hearing you say so and so. Now I might have it wrong. Is that right? Oh, okay, you're saying that. Okay, great. Well, why is that important to you? So it's asking those questions. Sometimes it's listening to what's not being said and just kind of taking it in and going, yeah, I totally get that. But if you don't feel like you've gotten it right, ask. Get them to validate and verify whether or not you actually have it in your brain the right way.
Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. We're going to have to start wrapping this up. So I'd like to ask you, what's your bottom line advice or, the best little takeaway you can give when it comes to communications and conversation?
I think first of all, it's no one's great at it. So I think that anybody that listens to the call, I think you want, I don't want anybody to get beaten up or feel like they're going to beat themselves up, because no one's an expert at conversations. No one is an expert at this stuff. Everyone, it's a lifelong pursuit to then become, good to great at these types of things. So I think as you focus on that person in front of you when you're having a conversation, try to think like a horse with blinders on. And literally try to shut down all the multi-processes and the multitasking, and put your smartphone away, and for a very short amount of time, just focus on them. And if you just focus on them and you're listening and you're asking questions, you're going to get far more out of that particular conversation than you ever would if you didn't. And I think ultimately, communication is knowing the audience at a deeper level.
I love it. That's great advice. Now, you're all over the Internet, so it should be pretty easy for people to find you, but if our listeners have any questions, what is the best way to get in touch with you?
Probably email William@Tincup, Tincup.com, or Twitter, William Tincup on the Twitter. And Stephanie, I'd love for you to take a look. I just did a blog post for Fistful of Talent. I think it was yesterday or the day before, but it was about tattoos in the workplace. And the comment section is actually, my blog post is okay, but the comment section is fantastic, because people are starting to weave in other types of things like piercing and colored hair and all these other types of things, and how people make decisions and are biased against these types of things or not. So I would love for you to take a look at that at one point. But yeah, communication with me is easy. Just Google my name and you'll be able to find me.
Perfect. I will definitely check out that post, and I encourage our listeners to check out your blog posts. You're all over the place. You're at Fistful of Talent. You are at HR Examiner. You're at Talent Culture. And, of course, they can find you every day with Brian Wempen on Drive Through HR. This has been a really, really great conversation. I want to thank you for a great conversation. We appreciate your time, and thanks for sharing all this information with us. It was a pleasure.
All righty. Well, thank you very much.
You've been listening to The Proactive Employer with Stephanie Thomas. We are happy to answer any questions you may have, and we encourage you to contact us with suggestions for future installment topics. You can find our contact information on the podcast homepage, www.theproactiveemployer.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us for future installments of The Proactive Employer.
Napa know-how.
A Napa guy knows more isn't always better, unless we're talking about full-size vans. These beasts do more than get you from A to B. They have so much space a man can live in it. With shag carpeting, water bed, and a sweet lava lamp, these mobile abodes have all the comforts of home. With quality parts and plenty of Napa know-how, you can keep the original tiny house running longer, stronger. That's Napa know-how.
Napa know-how.
Support for this podcast comes from the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, ranked one of the top cancer centers in the nation for the last 27 years. The doctors at MD Anderson treat more rare cancers in a single day than many physicians see in a lifetime, and treatment plans are tailored to an individual patient's needs, allowing more comprehensive and thorough care. To become a patient, please visit makingcancerhistory.com.